He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. What's up, everybody? I hope you enjoyed that special intro. I'm Daniel Cody, host of The Danny Show. Welcome, or should I say, to the Danny Funhouse. I'm your host, and this is where I give commentary and reviews on all things wrestling. And as you can see by the intro, today is the day of the Eater of Worlds, Bray Wyatt, whom we all wish was still under contract with WWE or in some other great wrestling promotion. But for now, today, I'm going to give you my top 10 favorites as a custom on this channel. I'm going to give you my top 10 favorite Bray Wyatt matches. And fun fact, I did not know this, but did you know Bray Wyatt and Bo Dallas are real life brothers? But here's what I did not know. Wrestler IRS is the father of Bray Wyatt as well as Bo Dallas. There's a fun fact for you. But let's get started with my top 10 favorite Bray Wyatt matches. After Husky Harris. No, that's not on this list. But either way, let's get started. At number 10, we have Bray Wyatt at the Elimination Chamber 2017, where he would win the WWE World Heavyweight Championship from a then champion, John Cena. However, this was the Elimination Chamber, so it featured Cena, AJ Styles, Bray Wyatt, I believe Randy Orton wasn't there, was it? Okay. Cena, Bray, AJ, I think Corbin was in there, and a couple of other guys. But either way, great match. Bray would win his, I believe, that was his first ever WWE Championship in that Elimination Chamber that year. John Cena's reign was very short. At number 9, we have Bray Wyatt as The Fiend, facing off against Daniel Bryan, whom I did a review on yesterday. He faced off against Daniel Bryan at the Royal Rumble 2019. Now, they faced off at the Royal Rumble twice, and one of them was in 2014. The second one was 5 years later, ironically. Fun fact, Bray Wyatt won both Royal Rumbles, but this particular one was a strap match. After shaving Daniel Bryan nearly bald, he would face him off in a strap match, which was not a good idea by Bryan. Nonetheless, Bray Wyatt, of course, would win the match, retaining his WWE Universal Championship, which he reigned on at the time. Speaking of Universal Champions, that brings me to number 8, when Bray Wyatt faced now the longest Universal Heavyweight Champion of all time, Roman Reigns. Before Roman Reigns was the God mode heel that we all know and in some ways, deep down, somewhat love. Before he was that, he was just Roman Empire. And this all started because Bray Wyatt cost Roman a chance to fight for the championship when he ruined his Money in the Bank ladder match near victory. Anybody but Roman. Now it's Roman and no one else. Either way, they faced off at Battleground 2016, and it was a good match. However, it was a match that Bray Wyatt would win, be it the help of Luke Harper, God rest his soul. And fun fact, and I also pointed this out in my review of WrestleMania 37 Night 2, that Bray Wyatt, as The Fiend, during a match with Randy Orton, paid tribute to Luke Harper with the special Yeah. That nobody wanted to point out, by the way. Either way, good match. Moving on to number 7, we have Bray Wyatt versus Chris Jericho at SummerSlam 2014. This was a pretty good match. We saw the best of Jericho as well as the best of Bray Wyatt. It was a rematch from Battleground, which Jericho won. However, this time at SummerSlam 2014, it would be Bray Wyatt who would score his second victory in a row at SummerSlam, defeating the Jericho Society host Bray Wyatt. I mean, Chris Jericho. However, when the match was over, he sung the song that I sung at the beginning. He's got the whole world, which is his favorite song as of 2014 and moving forward. Speaking of which, that brings me to number 6. Speaking of that song, we have Bray Wyatt versus John Cena at Extreme Rules in a steel cage match. It was a rematch for WrestleMania 30, and at WrestleMania 30, I will be honest, I was rooting for Cena. But Bray Wyatt, despite being a heel, was really getting over with the crowd, and the crowd was loving him. I guess the crowd just got tired of being told who they were supposed to love, I guess. So they were told they were supposed to cheer Cena because he's the good guy. But of course, everybody treats Cena 50-50. So even the most hated villain could get a cheer if they face off against John Cena. So Bray Wyatt was really getting over with the crowd. And there was a special moment during the match where just as John Cena was about to win, a child stood outside of the cage singing He's Got the Whole World. Except they had it in demon voice mode. The eerie scene of the child singing would be enough to distract John Cena long enough for Bray Wyatt to attack and go for the victory. Because Cena was a man of the kids. The kids loved him. The young wrestling fans really loved him. However, Bray Wyatt was starting to interest the kids as well as the adults at the time. Strange. At number 5, we have The Fiend versus Seth freaking Rollins at Crown Jewel 2019. This was a rematch for Hell in a Cell, which also, may I just point out for a second that it would have been okay if they had a finish. The fans were hot that the match did not have a finish. It ended in no contest. The fans were so pissed off that they started chanting for AEW, which was really starting to get popular at the time because it was 2019. AEW was really starting to take off. Either way, Bray Wyatt would get his rematch at Crown Jewel, and the match could not be stopped under any circumstances. And what made this match extra special is just like Kane versus Mankind at Survivor Series 97, they continued to let Bray Wyatt wrestle under the dark red light. And the match was good. It was very entertaining. And Bray Wyatt won his second high class championship, but it was his first Universal Championship because the Universal Championship is the one with the colors. However, Bray Wyatt, or The Fiend rather, defeating Seth Rollins at Crown Jewel settled the rivalry. At number 5, we have, speaking of the Shield, we have another Shield member. Fun fact, Bray Wyatt has defeated every member of the Shield. And at number 5, no, Seth was number 5. At number 4, we have Bray Wyatt versus Dean Ambrose at TLC 2014. Now, these guys had great matches. 2014's Survivor Series ended up in a double draw. However, this match was another chapter written in the rivalry. I really enjoyed this one. We saw Dean Ambrose do a lot of crazy moves, entertaining moves, with 3 elbow dives on off ladders onto tables, but it was Bray Wyatt who would capitalize after Dean Ambrose electrocuted himself halfway. While we're on the subject, let me guys ask you something. Let me ask you guys something for fun. Just to do a little fantasy warfare. John Moxley, not Dean Ambrose, John Moxley, because let's be honest, John Moxley is a lot more brutal. John Moxley versus The Fiend. Sounds good, doesn't it? But the question I want to ask you guys is this: who would win? Now, not Dean Ambrose, John Moxley, because if you're going to face The Fiend, you got to have your most brutal side. John Moxley versus The Fiend in an unsanctioned match. Anything goes, thumbtacks, everything. Who's your pick? Let me know. But either way, in the TLC match, Bray Wyatt won, and it was a great match. At number 3, we have Bray Wyatt versus Wyatt family fellow member Braun Strowman in a swamp match at the horror show Extreme Rules. Now let me just say, Extreme Rules, the horror show, was a pretty interesting pay-per-view. I really thought it was interesting, with the exception of the eye for an eye match, because watching Seth put out Ray's eye and then vomit later, not my favorite match. Yes, I was rooting for Rey Mysterio, but seeing that again, it was too much. Just too much for me. But either way, that match, and this was 2020, so there were no audiences. So they had to come up with epic cinematic matches, and I really appreciated all those cinematic matches that they have. You have Tommaso Ciampa and Johnny Gargano in an empty arena. You had the Boneyard match, which was everyone's favorite match of the year. And then you had the Swamp match. It was a match that we saw Bray Wyatt, the original Bray Wyatt, not the Mr. Rogers Bray Wyatt. The original Bray Wyatt came back to challenge him because he defeated the Mr. Rogers Wyatt, Branham speaking of, at Money in the Bank. So the rematch happened at Extreme Rules, and we saw Bray Wyatt, the original one, face off against Braun Strowman. And of course, near the end of the match, just when we thought it was over, because you saw the copyright clip on the right-hand side letting you know the show was over. But then the thing went off, and Braun Strowman was pulled into the lake, and who came out? The Fiend. Now, I'm going to tell you guys something. I wasn't reviewing wrestling yet, but I saw this match right before I went to bed. So, I'm saying, my point, it's a miracle I didn't have nightmares. I was more interested than scared. And speaking of Dark Souls, let's go to number 3. This was a dream match for the ages, folks. Bray Wyatt and his eerie persona faced off against the man that paved the way for it all. I'm talking about The Undertaker, one of my all-time favorites. This was a dream match. We never got to see Sting versus The Undertaker, unfortunately, but this was still good. The Undertaker was not ready to pass the torch. Bray Wyatt taunted The Undertaker, saying that he used to fear him until he lost at WrestleMania 30. So The Undertaker hadn't been seen in a year. He comes back and he faces Bray Wyatt at WrestleMania 31. And so the only thing that kind of was bittersweet about it is that it happened in California. And I love California, but it should have been in a closed setting arena so we can both see them have dark entrances, because the entrances weren't dark because it was still somewhat daylight, because they had to start WrestleMania early on California's coast, because on the East Coast it was near 10 at the time. So it was a 3-hour time difference. However, the match was still great. I really enjoyed it. And California is still cold, by the way. East Bay if you're a rock fan. But either way, the match was great. I really enjoyed it. And even though Bray Wyatt lost the match to my all time favorite, the match was still great. And the Eater of Worlds had an amazing showing, kicking out of the first tombstone. Let's point that out. Going to number one, and I'm sorry that was number two, that was not number three. Undertaker versus Bray Wyatt, that's number two. At number one, we have Bray Wyatt versus Randy Orton and the House of Horrors match at Payback 2017. Now, let me just say, the eerie storylines were very entertaining. Bray Wyatt bringing Randy into the the family. Randy Orton burning Sister Abigail's house down, and then the match that took place at House of Horrors, not to mention the Inferno match. But this match is going to be on the list because it was a match that Bray Wyatt won. He fought Randy Orton in the House of Horrors, and then they went into the arena and continued the match there. Now, yes, he had help from challenger and contender for the WWE Championship, Jinder Mahal, who attacked Randy Orton, who was at the time champion. However, it does not take away from the fact that the match between those two and the rivalry between those two was awesome. Just downright awesome. I could watch Randy and Bray Wyatt rival all day. Two dark forces facing off. But before I go any further, I want to ask you guys one more fantasy question. I asked earlier about what do you think about Bray Wyatt as The Fiend versus Jon Moxley, but here's another one. Ministry Undertaker. Undertaker, Ministry of Darkness, 1999. Not corporate ministry, just flat out Ministry of Darkness versus The Fiend. Hell in the Cell. What's your pick? Who would you pick to win that match right there? That is a dream match that I wish would have happened. And you got to bring the 1999 Undertaker to face The Fiend because this was when the Undertaker was more dark and more sinister. So you got to bring out the darkest side to face The Fiend in Hell in a Cell. Who's your pick on that? Let me know in the comment section. I'm your host, Daniel Cody, and that's all the time I have for you today. Reminding you before I go, let him in. No, let me try it again. Remember, Bray Wyatt always lights the way. He's got the whole world in his hands. All you got to do is let him in.